This is Corregidor, where in May 1942, soldiers of the United States Army were humiliated as never before in their history. Prior to this surrender, 85% of our men, 9 out of 10, had already surrendered to a different enemy. Who was that enemy? The same enemy that successfully attacked the Air Force personnel of this convoy in September 1942. In spite of eluding the Japanese and crossing the Pacific, 50% of these fighting men never saw action. In October, halfway around the world, General Montgomery started the Alamein offensive that broke the back of Rommel's Africa Corps. At one point, he urgently needed 35 American fighter planes to protect his advanced positions. 11 of our planes did not leave the ground. Their pilots had met the enemy, and she had conquered. Yes, she was at Guadalcanal, the same enemy who strikes in the dark, who obeys no rules of warfare, who hides where she can't be seen. Now look at her and laugh. The malaria-carrying mosquito, the female Anopheles mosquito. This is your enemy. Remember her. Perhaps you'd like to know your chances of being sent to a combat area where there aren't any malaria-bearing mosquitoes. Here are your chances. This is where your enemy, spreading malaria, strikes. 7 continents. And this is where the air forces are fighting. Bases and transport routes in every center of infection. India. Here, 2 million die of malaria each year. West Africa. 85% of the population have malaria. The soldiers in Burma had it. So did the Chinese. The same death stalks New Guinea, the Solomons, the Middle East, Madagascar, the world over. Now, do you know your chances of getting malaria? Then perhaps you'd like to know how the Anopheles mosquito, the carrier of malaria, attacks you and how you can defend yourself. Let's take a look at this newly hatched female mosquito. Only the female carries the disease. Right now, she's limbering up for a career of wholesaling malaria, simply because of an overpowering thirst for human blood. And less than a mile away, she finds it. It makes no difference to her whether she gets her drink from a healthy person or from this native, already sick with malaria. So she jabs her beak into his skin and pumps up the blood, swarming with malaria parasites. Now she's had a full meal and loses no time flying back to a cool, shady spot to rest. While she's digesting the blood, the parasites are busy. They develop in her stomach. In 2 weeks, they've worked their way through the stomach wall, and now, in a form dangerous to humans, have moved up to the mosquito salivary gland. The Anopheles got infected when she bit a malarious person. Now she's ready to do a little infecting herself. Off she flies in search of another drink of blood, this time choosing a healthy person. She injects a little saliva full of malaria parasites. They get busy in this flyer's bloodstream, and it isn't long before another name is erased from the operations board. To combat this enemy, an effective program of malaria control has been put into action to protect Army Air Forces personnel. Its purpose is simple. Eliminate the mosquito or prevent her from getting at the soldier. First come collective measures. Before a campsite is chosen near a landing strip or airfield, medical officers with a survey squad are sent to find out the malaria situation in that area. Initially, a thorough investigation must be made of the native population to establish the percentage of inhabitants in that area who are infected. Next comes investigation of hospital, disease and death records, if available. Because malaria and certain kinds of climate go together, rainfall and other weather data are studied. Water is scooped from ponds and the telltale Anopheles larvae are identified. Marshes, pools, rivers, all possible mosquito breeding places are mapped. The survey squad stalks the adult mosquito in its favorite haunts: native huts, caves, hollow trees, almost any cool, shady place. From captured adult mosquitoes, medical officers determine the most prevalent species, the percentage already infected by malaria, their flight range, breeding rates, and habits, and their appetite for human blood. Once the survey squad has gathered its facts, they can plan their blitz against the Anopheles. The commanding officer, acting on a medical officer's advice, orders that crews be detailed to work on collective malaria control. After the campsite is selected, at least 1 mile upwind from infested native villages, and as far away as possible from Anopheles breeding places, the engineers use heavy equipment to attack the breeding grounds directly. Ditches and ponds are drained. Others are filled. Others are sprayed with oil, which spreads in a film over the water, and it isn't long before the mosquito larvae are out of business. They don't like Paris green either. It means sudden death, whether dished out by a single soldier or by specially equipped airplanes. Removing shady vegetation destroys some breeding grounds, but remember, not all mosquito habits are alike. Some breed in fast-running streams, others in stagnant pools, fresh water, or even brackish water. But you can depend on this: spraying will kill any adult mosquito. Spray everything. Airplanes that do no more than refuel in malarial areas. Trucks, buses, buildings, and especially nearby native villages. This is one type of sprayer, an aerosol bomb. When the aerosol bomb is not available, a hand sprayer is used. However, bombs and spray guns would do little permanent good if buildings were not screened. Doors should open outward to shoo away the mosquitoes, and all cracks or openings, such as ventilators, should be protected. But the protection of these collective measures is only a part of the general program devised by the Army Air Forces for combating malaria. On any South Pacific island such as this, the individual measures are far more important. So important, in fact, that upon a man's sense of responsibility and integrity may depend his length of service, his usefulness to his country, and his life. These two fighter pilots, Lieutenants Graham and Wald, were veterans. They knew the dangers of carelessness. This night, as always, they'd been out checking over their P-40s for the morning patrol. And night is the time the mosquitoes come out in force. So Graham and Wald wore gloves. For a bite on the hand is as dangerous as anywhere else. And head nets loosely draped to prevent a mosquito from feeding through them, even if she couldn't crawl through the openings. No bare skin was exposed. And if any had to be, why, here were bottles of GI insect repellent to smear on. They were careful. They were sensible. Prominently displayed on their tent pole was a copy of the general orders regarding malaria control. And they knew those paragraphs by heart. Graham and Wald observed a regular routine in going to bed at night. It didn't involve winding the alarm clock or throwing out the cat, but it was just as punctual. One step was an inspection of the bed netting for holes. Like every man in malaria country, Wald knew the foundation of all control measures was the bed netting. Without it, the rest of the work was a waste of time. Wald found a hole this night, which was nothing unusual. Patching it was no trick. A strip of adhesive tape, a little pressure, and patience. The repair, of course, was temporary, but it assured safety for the time being. Graham also had his share of the routine. His job was spraying the tent with an aerosol bomb, which he did thoroughly, killing off any uninvited guests who were hopefully hanging around. The dark corners were his special meat. His last move with the aerosol bomb was to carefully spray his own bed net. Plenty of the stuff went on Wald's bed net, too. He had no more desire to share his GI cot with a mosquito than Graham. Both of these men, as children, had probably been tucked in at night by their parents. But their parents were back home now, waiting for them. And in the South Pacific, you tuck yourself in, and carefully. A netting is no good if it isn't secure and tied down. A mosquito can come under as well as come through. Undressing was a pretty simple problem. Shirt and pants and shoes off, the candle blown out, and then into bed for a little last tucking in. No cleaning of teeth, no pleasant shower, no idle conversation. And if you said your prayers, you included a short prayer that no mosquito bit you. There was still one more item Graham and Wald could not afford to forget. The final interior inspections of their netting with flashlights. That was essential, and it couldn't be hurried. One little speck on that netting might be the difference between success and failure. Well, that was that. Aside from stifling heat and the restlessness caused by a long, hard day, there was nothing to prevent them from going off into dreamland. Nothing except a Jap air raid. No time for dressing, just what they had on, plus shoes and helmets. A foxhole was a lot better than a tent when they opened up on you. As he left, Wald remembered something. The bottle of repellent. They were getting close now, and Wald took the first foxhole at hand. Wald immediately put the repellent on his exposed skin, knowing that the enemy above was no more dangerous than the hidden enemy below. An aerosol bomb or a spray gun would have afforded the same protection as the repellent had they been handy. Graham was safe, too, in another foxhole. Reasonably safe. But that was the funny thing about malaria or any other kind of discipline. It had to be complete to be effective. And Graham had forgotten something. He didn't know it then, but he was hit that night, and much more effectively than anything the Japs hit. The following evening, the squadron lined up for their regular dose of Atabrine. They all knew, including the CO who was watching them, that though Atabrine was no substitute for other protective measures, it suppressed symptoms of malaria and held the disease at bay until it could be treated. Some hated the bitter taste, and some, like Graham, didn't like the idea that it occasionally turned their skins yellow temporarily. 2 weeks later, Graham was given a special mission, a long reconnaissance flight over enemy territory. There was no reason why he should remember up there that he'd been in a foxhole 14 days ago, slapping at a little sting on his neck, nor remember the Atabrine that he should have taken, but didn't. He had a headache, of course, and his stomach felt upset, but he thought he had a cold. Then he had a severe chill. That confirmed it. Nothing but a simple little cold. Since he felt lousy, he didn't keep watching the way he should. So when he finally saw he had company in that same patch of sky, he was close enough to recognize them. Zeroes. Too many to fight off, so you duck them. But you don't duck enough when you're sick. You don't dive the wings off the Zeroes. You don't turn inside of them. You don't get right down on the ground and run them bow-legged. You just get filled full of 20 millimeters and 303s. They didn't get him before he went over the side, and they didn't get him as he parachuted down. And there was land instead of salt water under him. A tree even broke his fall, and he got to the ground with no broken bones. He didn't have a bad setup, considering. He knew where he was and how to get back to the base. He could walk, and he had a jungle kit with the essentials for traveling. But Graham was a guy who believed in traveling light. He thought they were exaggerating a little bit about the jungle kit, just as they were about the Atabrine. The head net he could use, and the D ration, and the machete. The matches and iodine. Goodbye Atabrine again, along with the hone and the fishing tackle. The compass, of course, was essential. And now, gathering the stuff together, he was all ready. Ready to travel light and fast. He'd be right home, Mother. A nice setup. Nice, except for that headache and dizziness, that persistent sensation of sickness, that cold again. But once he got moving, he'd be all right. The jungle stretched on, hot and tormenting, forcing him to fight every step of the way. The green depths closed and he seemed lost in a void. He realized he was going to have to pull all his horsepower for this trip, but he didn't do so well. The malaria was burning in him now, and nausea racked his stomach empty. And the map blurred before his eyes when he tried to read it. Night brought little relief, except a brackish jungle stream where he could wash his aching head and try to satisfy a desperate thirst. Another day. But the fever was having its way now, and he had lost all sense of direction. He was even denied the chance of keeping what little strength he had. His stomach, exhausted by constant vomiting, refused the food he tried to eat. But he could still go on somehow, on all fours like an animal, crawling blindly into the jungle. Night came again. Graham's last night. He was on his feet in a final flare of energy. And then merciful blankness. The unconsciousness from which there is no recovery. Another man had died who needn't have died. From such apparently small things as a few minutes' carelessness in a foxhole and a refusal to accept the protection of Atabrine, which would have enabled him to reach his base despite being infected with malaria. His mistake can be made again and again in almost every theater in which the Army Air Forces operate. The one defense against that mistake is malaria discipline. Well, sir, that's the case history of Lieutenant Graham. I picked it as an example of what you'll face when you get to the spot you're shoving off for.
What I'll face?
Yes, Fred. What you'll face. You're the CO. You're responsible for the effective employment of malaria discipline by every man in your command.
All right. Then it's my responsibility. But I know that malaria isn't always fatal, and its results aren't always as far-reaching. Harry, I think you've been exaggerating just to scare me.
I intended to scare you, but I haven't exaggerated. True, malaria isn't always fatal. When properly treated, it's sometimes very mild. But in spite of the best treatment known to medical science today, we can never guarantee a total cure.
Well, I didn't realize that.
And not only is it far-reaching to the individual who gets malaria. For instance, take the tail gunner in a bomber. He may only have a mild case, but that bomber is grounded until a replacement arrives. The bomber formation is minus a plane and vulnerable. Possibly 1 or 2 planes shot down. 10 or 20 lives lost. So that single mild case of malaria can count for 10 or 20 deaths.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm beginning to see what you're driving at.
But don't think that only flyers get malaria. Come along, Fred. I want to show you something. When any man in the outfit contracts malaria, he breaks up the team just as effectively as the men who fly. Look at those men. Victims of mosquitoes. That man in the first bed, Sergeant Henneman. He went to the latrine one night dressed only in his underwear. A mosquito got him. He got malaria. Henneman's a cook. His job was to feed the other members of his team, but he failed them. They had to wait 5 days for a new cook to be flown in. 5 days. 15 indigestible meals cooked by an incompetent substitute. Their morale was shot. Their digestion was shot. And Henneman was too sick to even be sorry. Now take the man in the second bed. Sergeant Fry, one of the best crew chiefs in the South Pacific. His plane was scheduled for an important mission. He sweated over it all night with loving hands. But he neglected to use repellent on those loving hands and on all his other exposed skin. Bingo, malaria. Sergeant Fry let his team down just as surely as though he had put sand in the carburetor. Now, the man in the third bed is a private, Joe Welch. He thought that helping load the freight on cargo planes wasn't much of a job. So Welch broke rules. He and a transient flyer went out souvenir hunting in a native village where practically 100% of the natives had malaria. Welch thought that he'd put one over on the CO, but he came back inoculated with malaria. He wasn't on hand to help load caliber 50 ammunition when it was urgently needed. Yes, Welch put one over on the CO, all right, and so did his friend. A mosquito got him, too. The man in the fourth bed, S2 Intelligence. He could figure out the doings of the Jap, but he didn't use the brains he was born with when he came out of headquarters without tucking his pant cuffs into his leggings.
I'm convinced, Harry. I'll give my medical officer and the engineers free rein as soon as we land.
Well, that's all to the good, Fred. But it can't all be done by them. If the individual doesn't follow through, every malaria preventative they set up will be wasted.
Don't worry. I'll give orders.
That's not enough.
Why not?
Well, for 2 reasons. First, you've got to set an example for your officers and men to follow. You know, the mosquito has no regard for rank.
Second?
Well, before I could count on you to enforce malaria discipline, I had to show you the dangers of laxity. I think the same thing holds true for the rest of your team.
It probably does, but how can I help on that score?
Tell your officers and men that you're behind the medic's policy on malaria. Press the point home to each man that unless he's constantly on the alert and uses all protective measures available, he'll be a victim of the malaria mosquito.
Well, that's good.
I've had each precaution illustrated to serve as a constant reminder. Your medical officer should do the same. Take your Atabrine. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's best taken immediately after a meal, and take plenty of water with it. Check your bed net. Check it for holes. Patch up any that you find. Tuck it in well. Once inside, make sure you haven't a mosquito for company. Use your net no matter where you sleep, even if it's in your plane. And apply repellent before you get in bed. Try to keep from tossing. If you touch against the bed net, the mosquito can get you through the netting. Spray regularly. Use the aerosol bomb or spray gun at dusk and again at dawn. Mosquitoes haunt the dark, so take extra precautions in the corners. And spray under your bed and table. Don't take chances. Dress properly. Head net, gloves, long sleeve shirt with collar and sleeves buttoned. Pants tucked into leggings or mosquito boots. But that's not all. Use repellent. Shake a liberal amount into the palm of your hand. Rub your hands briskly together, spreading the repellent on your palms, fingers, and the back of your hands. Next, rub the excess thoroughly over the back of your neck, your ears, and your face, taking care to avoid your lips and eyes. Then rub your hands across your shoulder blades, the small of your back, the seat of your pants, your waistline, elbows, and knees, any place your clothing is tight. When you've got your head net in place and your gloves on, have someone spray your clothing until it's thoroughly permeated with repellent.
I know you're right, Harry. I believe those precautionary measures are absolutely necessary, but something like that'll be hard to convince. That's a lot of work.
That's your job. You've got to make them and more. Under certain conditions where sweating is excessive, a man on night duty will have to be sprayed again with repellent after several hours. The medical officer will determine the time limit of its effectiveness. In simple words, if you want to fight Japs or Germans, you first have got to fight mosquitoes. In some areas, the heaviest casualties in this war have been caused by mosquitoes, not by the Axis. And remember this, science today has found no total cure for malaria.
Oh, that's really rugged.
But you want to protect your team. So never lose sight of the fact that you've an enemy who's deadlier than the Jap. An enemy all men have got to guard against all of the time. And that enemy is the Anopheles mosquito.